like to start by speaking to one of your most recent games, John Wick Hex. Describe how it felt getting the call from Mark Bithell to compose a John Wick game.
Um, it was tremendously exciting. Mike and I had been friends for a few years, and uh, just as fellow travelers in the game industry, basically, there was no subtext of we're friends because we are going to inevitably work together. I am friends with a lot of people who don't hire me because there's no obligation to hire someone you're friends with. And there's plenty of, in fact, a perfect example is Tim Schafer is also a friend of mine, and so is the composer that he regularly works with, Peter McConnell. And I wouldn't dream of working with Tim at the expense of his relationship with Peter, because one of the things I love so greatly about Tim's games are Peter's scores for them. And so with that in mind, there's been, particularly on the game Thomas Was Alone, my friend and colleague David Housden wrote a really beautiful score. And so, my feeling is Mike should do whatever Mike wants to do. But we were friends. All that said, he was one of those people I kind of always dreamed of working with, because I was such a fan of not just Thomas Was Alone, but Subsurface Circular and Subsurface Quarantine. Those games in particular, I thought were inventive, interesting. They were the kinds of storytelling that I like to find ways to combine music with, all that sort of thing. And so he reached out summer of last year, 2018, and said, I have something that we could potentially work on together. And I was kind of like, really? And so he didn't say what it was, though. And then and then I can't remember how soon thereafter it was like, okay, I'd love to do this with you. Here's what the project is. And it's John Wick, but it's also not what you're thinking. It's not a shooter or some other kind of ultra high octane game. It's a strategy game. And I said, where on earth did that come from? And he said, well, how else are you going to make a John Wick game? And that's to me, that was such an illustrative comment on his part, because it was his design, his brain for design, sees things in very certain ways. And to him, John Wick could only be a game of this type of mechanics, because his interest was not in this sort of Max Payne style shooter with bullet time or something in order to let you achieve the sort of choreography. He thought, John Wick in those games moves with such speed and such clarity. It's almost that he just exists outside of time relative to us normal people. And so the game should as well. And that's essentially what turn-based strategy achieves. And I remember thinking, well, hell, that's actually pretty sensible now that I hear your take on it. And so then, yeah, off we went and worked on it for the better part of a year. And then it came out, and I was thrilled. I kind of thought it would be polarizing, although it seemed to be generally quite well received. I didn't know if it was going to be one of those that kind of divided people neatly down the middle. It seemed like overwhelmingly those that checked it out seemed to kind of get his perspective and were able to embrace it.
Well, that's exactly as you mentioned. You say when he described it and explained, well, how else would you do it? It really does come across through the gameplay and the mechanics that is exactly how it should have been played out. Having had the privilege of reviewing it myself, I was lucky enough to see that and understand that. So I completely agree.
Great.
Speaking to that, John Wick Hex was widely praised for its score. How did you go about creating the divine and unique atmosphere for each really distinct level within the game?
The divine atmosphere? Is that what you said?
Each one was very unique and had this beautiful atmosphere to it. So I think it's descriptive.
Well, that's very generous. It's very appreciated, but it's probably far too generous. But I mean, the thing was, obviously there's 3 films that have scores to them that that was the first question I had. Every time I've ever worked on an IP that has existed with some kind of musical precedent, the first question I ask is, to what extent should I pay attention to that? Is that something I need to, tip a hat to? Is it something I need to be very deferential to? Is it something I should be ignoring or conscientiously staying away from? There's a whole spectrum of possible relationships to existing music. And in this case, because the game is a prequel to the movies, and because of its, the mechanics and everything we were just talking about, aesthetically it has room, and it also has this kind of graphic novel quality visually that separates it from the films as well. Even though it has that kind of extreme color and lighting and all that, but still, obviously, you wouldn't confuse them. And so as a result, it kind of gives us permission to do our own thing. So the general idea was, for the first level of the game, for the Chinatown sort of tutorial level where we onboard the player kind of step by step, which is obviously a very standard way that games are designed. You kind of tiptoe into your various mechanics and things out of the gate. He said, what if we make somewhat of a concerted effort to be in the same ballpark overall musically, and then successively, level by level from here forward, give ourselves permission to kind of abandon that and do our own thing. So it's kind of like there can be a dose of the familiar, and then we can do anything we want. And certainly on like the Lionsgate side of things, they were perfectly fine with that. I never got any kind of executive studio notes saying, this is off brand for John Wick or whatever. I think by virtue of them hiring Mike and just knowing that he's this kind of auteur game designer, that he's going to go do his own thing. And if you're not interested in that, you shouldn't hire him to begin with. And music gets to roll into that. And so, yeah, there's a real kind of sound to what Tyler, and help, by the way, also Tyler Bates is a friend of mine, and I didn't want to disrespect his work as well. And so that was the other aspect of how do I kind of balance all those things. And so I liked this idea of there being something not fully an homage, but something that is understanding of and appreciative of his work in the early parts of the game, and then increasingly unaware of that as we go. And past that, I don't really know how to answer your question, because it was just one of those where I would look at what the sort of point of the level was. One of the things that I like is that this whole thing is sort of being narrated by Hex. So there's this kind of storytelling mythos nature to it, where it lets you be a little bit theatrical. In fact, I was saying to Mike, I've never had an easier time in my life coming up with track titles for the album, because all I had to do was just extract a line or two from Hex's dialogue, and it was perfectly emblematic of everything I wanted that level to be. And he was saying, yeah, he said it's such a fun world to write for, because it's almost Shakespearean, and it's drama, and it's over the topness, and it's very theatrical. The movies and the game gives you that permission to be as well. And so I just thought, let's just kind of embrace that harder and harder and harder as we go, even while staying within the fact that, it's not orchestral. It's not, I'm not going to veer into something that would almost come across as avant-garde in this context. Like if it was suddenly big band jazz, for example, you would think, what on earth are they doing? I get that you want to be different from the movies, but this feels different just to be different. And that's, to me, not a terribly authentic thing to do. And so I stayed within that kind of grungy, borderline metal rock vibe with a heavy amount of electronic programming. And one of the things that was tapped gently in the scores of the films that I wanted to bring out way more was an almost spaghetti Western sense of like there's just a little bit of that in the movies. And I thought that we can dial that knob quite a bit more. So I pull some of those gestures out for fun. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question in terms of how it was. But I don't know how I do anything I do. I just try to, I just kind of, it's like a clay sculptor where you just kind of fuss with it until it's ready to go in the oven, I guess, and commit to the baking process, because it's so often just the iterative nature of, I don't ever, to steal your word, I don't divine it where it just occurs to me and I go, it's this. It almost never is that the case. You put something down and very often it's like, oh, I hate this. This is horrible. And I have no business doing this career. And then you realize, okay, that's always the first step, is to put down something that's not working or feels somehow inadequate. and then massage it or use it as a way to realize what it shouldn't be and throw it out completely and try again. And John Wick was no different than virtually any other score I've written in that sense.
Cool.
So, but it was just such good fun because of the theatricality of it. Also, the thing that's interesting is, 99% of the score is gameplay driven, in which um, I'm not contending with dialogue and I'm not contending with scripted story events and things like that. And so I was able to really let the music be a kind of standalone element in a way that many other games, I have to kind of duck in and out of scripted events where where it's important that the actors get the shine or the whatever specific gameplay thing going on gets the focus. It was able to be more silent film-esque in that way, which is more along the lines of something like Journey or Abzû, where I'm given this platform that's very unconstrained and it's very lucky, very different from a lot of other games, especially very cutscene driven games, which admittedly I haven't done a huge number of those, but I've done a fair amount, and you can really feel the difference when the music. I don't have to think at all about, okay, well, is this going to work if the character's speaking quietly, because that changes everything you write if suddenly you have those sorts of considerations to take into account.
No, that's a really interesting comparison between working on something that is more driven by dialogue and other elements. So that's interesting to hear.
Yeah, you always
It's
have
all.
to remember that this is a team sport. I'm collaborating with artists and game designers and actors and and sound designers and all kinds of people that we're all trying to tell this one story or create an environment for the player to experience something, and
Yes.
or a story or even just a purely mechanics driven kind of thing. And my role within that is often, it changes with every game, and the degree to which I'm leaned on. Some games the music plays a much larger role than other games, obviously, and so I'm always trying to make sure that I'm not overstepping and kind of subverting someone else's efforts because the thing is designed to lean more heavily on them than me. That
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Always a hard question to ask, but and I will
Interesting.
preface this just a little. Um, so the score for the level Elysium in particular, for me when playing it, really stood out. The moment where the player enters the nightclub and all of a sudden the music just grows and bolsters. And there was something really overwhelming about it that was really well done. So that's what stood out for me. But what was your favorite composition in the score and why?
Well, I'm grateful that you like that, because it's anything that kind of falls remotely under the EDM or the dance music umbrella, even if it's a kind of a subversion of that, which I would argue that the Wick section is, because it's like a dance of death, the that anytime I'm in that space, it's certainly, as someone who comes from a pretty classical and acoustic and orchestral background, there's always a certain aggravated imposter syndrome when I'm playing with those toys. Even though I've done it a lot, it's just not what I'm sort of known for, and it's definitely not what I've done overall. I mean, it represents a minority of my overall time spent, and so I'm grateful that it didn't come off ridiculously. And
Not at all.
I did send early drafts to a couple of composer friends to say, like, is this just completely ridiculous? And particularly for some production advice, a good friend actually, Darren Korb, the composer of the Supergiant games like Hades and Pyre, Transistor, and Bastion, he actually was passing through LA about a year ago for the Game Awards, and I said, you might come over to the studio so I can show you some stuff and you can just basically tell me I'm either an idiot or not. And we sat there, and he had some great ideas, and it was actually really, I made sure he's listed in the special thanks, because it was just like a couple hours before we went and had dinner and just hung out for the night, that I showed him a few specific, because we're talking very technical things where it's like, I'm using this particular plugin to reinforce the sub bass frequencies on my kick bass drum, but I'm not convinced that it's the best way to go. What do you think? And he's like, oh, well, on Transistor, this is how I would do it, and try this. And it's, oh, wow, that really makes it pop. That's an interesting idea. And he's a very gifted producer, and composer and singer and everything. But anyway, all that said, this is all me. This is all my way of avoiding answering your actual question, because the truth is, I don't actually have. It sounds like a kind of generic cop out, but I really don't have a favorite. The only time I ever have anything on any project that starts to resemble that is when the memories outside of the music, like, as an example, in Journey, for example. There's a moment at the kind of apex of the game right before you go off into the mountain and the snow, and it takes this dramatic nosedive into kind of darkness. There's this moment where there's a sort of a cutscene where the player is doing this big panoramic spin at these pictograms, showcasing all the chapters of their experience up to that point. And I remember I wrote the music before they had the visuals. I just had a kind of vague description of what it was going to be, and there was sort of like a storyboard or something. And it was originally not going to be what is in the final game. And I wrote a piece of music kind of inspired by their pitch and sort of the emotions that they were aspiring to. And then I remember they created a first draft of it, and the scene was very sort of boring. And the music, I felt self-conscious because I thought, well, the scene is probably what they want it to be, but the music is trying to sell you on this idea of some grand adventure and epic saga. And I said to the creative director, Genova, I think the music is sort of trying to convince the player of this being more important than the game itself believes it to be. And so I should reel this in. I should walk it way back dramatically. And I remember Genova said, no, actually, we all love what the music is doing so much. We're going to redesign the scene to try to catch up with you, because you're doing what we aspire to, and we basically failed in our first draft, and we're going to try again. So don't change anything. And so that cue ended up never changing. It's on the soundtrack album. We call it The Final Confluence. And so it's one of those where I wouldn't call that, my favorite piece of music, but that's a really interesting memory in the process of working on that game, of something that was kind of a unusual moment that's not typical for a composer, and it felt very, it felt like, wow, I feel lucky that I managed to kind of get inside your brain and score the scene as you hope it is, rather than sort of the scene as it actually is. So, it's the same with John Wick, where I go and I look at specific moments of it, and I have memories of like excited conversations with Mike about this, or the first time I played that, or the first time I saw that character design. And those are the things that bring, my happiness to mind. And it's not so much like, oh, that track is just the best thing ever. So I'm sorry, it sounds kind of like a cop-out, but I just invariably, to me, everything I write, to me, just kind of always feels unfinished and is sort of frustrating. So I don't look back and say, now there's a hell of a thing. The closest I ever truly come, now that I think about it a moment longer, to what you're describing is sometimes, if it's an orchestral score at least, sometimes there's a particularly good memory associated with recording a specific piece where, like, the musicians really just nail it in a way that's magical, or somebody makes a suggestion in the orchestra and then we do it, and it's just like the thing that was missing that I couldn't quite find on my own or whatever. And then those become special memories because that moment was great, but it's never owing to my own writing. It's owing to the kind of context of the creative production process, or similar to that.
And what a wonderful way to describe that, in not having favorites, but in more having particular memories that resonate closer. And that's a much nicer answer than I would have hoped for anyway. So thank you.
Well, it's the truth. I mean, it's one of those that, the cliche is that how could I pick a favorite, because it's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child. And as cliche as that is, there is a lot of truth to it. To me, if one piece stood out as a favorite, it would actually be alarming to me that I somehow let something be better than all the rest of the music, because it's like, well, why should that one be the best? Because that other one, I not work as hard on this other one, or you know what I mean? Like it starts to create this
Yes.
sense of like, and then that brings to mind all this other neurosis of, well, maybe I'm not as professional as I think I am, that I'm basically letting go of pieces that can ship with the game or the film or
Yes.
whatever, that I actively am aware are not as important to me as these others. And it's like, I shouldn't let that happen. I'm a little too idealistic. And even on a score, you look at like Assassin's Creed Syndicate or even this game I just shipped right before John Wick called Erica, where you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of individual pieces of music, and some of which are
Yes.
like 3 seconds long, some of which are one note. There, it's like a stinger that drops right on top of the cue based on something that the player does. It's like even those which are seemingly objectively less important than the big dramatic, finale or whatever, they're really not less important though, because the finale will mean nothing if the progression towards it is not given all the same amount of care and seriousness. So yeah, it's tricky because I don't ever want to avoid that question or feel like I have no opinion. It's just we try to give every last note, everything we've got, even if it serves a more humble purpose in the
Yes.
overall scope of the game.